Well, good afternoon and a belated further welcome to the Blavatnik School of Government. I'm Nairi Woods, the founding dean of the Blavatnik School. And I really just wanted to say, on behalf of all my colleagues, not just those you're meeting, how delighted we are to see you all here and the energy in this room. Some 15 years ago, my colleagues and I here at Oxford decided that we needed to build a school of government which would support and help governments of all kinds in all continents to do better. That's hard. A New York banker said to me, "What? You're trying to persuade people who could go and get secure, highly paid, unpolitically exposed jobs to go into politics, be totally politically exposed, underpaid job insecurity." The former minister of Zimbabwe sitting smiling in front of me knows exactly what I'm speaking about. And yes, as every one of you knows in this room, because you are experts in one of the most fundamental things that government creates an ecosystem for, which is education and opportunity. Government, whether you love it or hate it, matters massively. And a small change in government can change millions of lives. So our bet in the school is to do three things that we think will make a difference. And the first is to attract brilliant public service, other people-oriented leaders to come to have their public service, their desire to go into politics or to go into public service nurtured and nourished within the school and to be supported afterwards to go back out into the world. We have the former minister from Zimbabwe here with us today. I'm thrilled that this year we have our first two fully funded scholarships from Zimbabwe who will be welcoming to the school. And they are two of 123 students who will join us on full scholarships in this coming year, age 30 to 48, to come and to embark on their journey, either to continue their public service or to begin it. That's our first bet. Our second bet, and this comes to all of you, is to do the kind of research that helps people on the front line do better, to do an engaged kind of research that instead of problem observing from 30,000 miles up and helpfully pointing out 20 years after the fact that the government got it thoroughly wrong, that we could do a kind of engaged research that gives people practical lessons, but from this rigorous and independent standpoint, which is a different one to consultants and to the public servants themselves. And the third goal of the school is to bring people together, and this touches all of you, to a belief that people will stand more chance of getting it right when they're a phone call away, a Teams call away, a tweet away from somebody else who's trying to get it right in another community. And that's what you are all here doing today. It's building that community, which isn't just fun because you're all amazing and getting to know each other, but brings about the magic that human beings can bring about when they don't just work transactionally together, but when they work together with trust and with a knowledge of each other and a sense of shared purpose. So thanks for being here. Thanks for all that you do to improve education around the world. I hope this is your first of many visits to the Blavatnik School of Government, and you'll encourage future leaders to come and work with us. Thank you again, and I'll hand to Stefan.
Well, thank you very much, Nairi. I know you have other engagements now. I'm not sure I can follow this with the same spirit and energy, but I fortunately have four people here, four stars, who will be sparkling here in a keynote panel. You know, they could be sparkling. Maybe it will be a bit of Star Wars. I don't know what it can be, but let's hope so. So we have actually four people, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time to introduce. You know, I think they're actually all very well known. Their bios and bit of detail is also up there and in all the documentation, but these are people that have been one way or another, or are one way or another, at the front line of, finding that link between science, between research and implementation, that are not just focusing on the what to do, but actually have been forced, given the way they have to work, to think more about the how to get it done. And that's a little bit what we want to get there. This is not a session that's going to talk about what we should be doing, but actually how it can be done, how can science and research and implementation science actually help us maybe understand a bit more. Now they're going to talk about their experiences, hopefully inspire and get you some stories here and there. And then hopefully we'll have a lot of Q&A time for them. So let me just start maybe with Rukmini. You've been as leading Pradam. It's most appropriate that she comes first because it means first. It means primary. It means first in the thing. So she has to come here first. But it's of course a very well-known organization. But I don't need to say an awful lot about it beyond like, how do I, if I were to suddenly, without any preparation, say something, is say, look, this is quite an interesting organization because it is always been trying to implement at scale, but it's also really trying very early on to be very research-oriented. Now, and I just wonder whether you could tell us a little bit about, how do you maneuver in that space? What are the challenges, the opportunities you see from that, and get a bit of a sense of it of, to go to the title of this panel, the potential and pitfalls of actually doing implementation in a scientific, rigorous way.
Okay. So first of all, I want to welcome everyone to the most colorful panel of this conference. Let's hope that the color remains even when we speak. I have to say that I don't know about the other panels, but I was waiting for some questions or guidelines or something from our leader, which I don't know if you sent it, but I didn't read it. And I've been very worried about the words here, because I don't know about many of you are very young, but when we were in school, we were told, look at the title and, be to the point. So potential and pitfalls, I haven't thought of any pitfalls. Is that okay? Do I still qualify to be here? No, jokes apart, I think this is a very important, platform. That how do you as implementers, how do we at least as implementers really learn in a systematic way from what we are doing? And how do we also use the researchers or the research that's happening around us? Now, it's all been live streamed and stuff, so I should be very politically correct. But recently I've learned in the last 5 years that you're supposed to have a strategic plan. You're supposed to have a whole theory of change and so on. So, I could formulate this to say, how did I navigate the world of research in some very systematic way? Actually, things just happen to you. And I think it's a question of how do you take that thing that happens to you and what do you make of it? So a couple of things happened to Pratham. One is that the two founders, we have two founders who happen to be university people. And they're therefore brought into the whole business, probably some systematic way of thinking, some view on enquiry, although they came from very different disciplines. Another thing that happened to Pratham was, I don't know when it was, Dean may remember, 2000 or something, some researchers from MIT walked into our office. I was, for one, very suspicious. Why are these guys in our office? And our office was very small, so some people had to get out to let these people come in. But then, there too, a friendship developed, and I think it has gone a long way. So you could have very rigorous work happening, but happening very close to the ground. And at the same time, I think we had a lot of internal curiosity as well. And I think the internal curiosity often, and I'm sure we are not the only people, if you have a lot of ambition and you have very limited resources, the only way to balance and limited capability, the only way to balance it out is to figure out what actually works. What is it that you can make happen? And the resources and the needs, I think, are often thought about. But I think we've thought quite a bit from the beginning about what are we capable of doing. So we are very capable of doing things like ASR or teaching at the right level. we are not capable, and I have some colleagues in the room, I hope they'll agree, of teaching trigonometry or algebra or things like that. So what is it that you're capable of? What is it that people like us are capable of? I think that has been a factor through this. But these different layers happening together, I think have been very interesting for us. So I will move on because you don't want to hear my whole autobiography, but there was one RCT that was happening in rural Bihar, which is my state. And our teams were, obviously, the intervention teams were very involved. And this is a statement that one of our very young field workers said. There were 3 treatment arms, and of course a control group. And so we were going down and she said, this is treatment A, this is treatment B, this is treatment C, this is control. And then she pointed to a school and said, and this one is out of control. But I think that just this systematic way of thinking, some of it was happening internally, but some of it also, what is it that you're trying to test? And I do think that in terms of learning from implementation, there has to be a healthy dose of curiosity. There has to be a healthy dose of skepticism. I always think some amount of productive arguing is a very good thing because there should be within any program some tension about should we do this or should we do that, because there's always many things to do. So how do you keep that, productive tension and curiosity and argumentation up? And how do you share what you're learning? I think these are the 2 things that I would say come into how do you learn a little systematically from implementation.
It's excellent. I mean, you're clearly a true professional because it's exactly in line with the concept note that I sent you. And points about me. So Lewis, see when you can pull that off as well. But it's a scene from, you have this position in the World Bank. The World Bank is this organization with, well, let's say very diffuse power and lots of centers of influence and power. It's a whole game. But at the same time, when it comes to what, you probably have quite a clear brief in terms of what to do. But how it gets done, you then become dependent on a partner in country. And so just tell me a little bit about, this whole issue about how to do this systematically and actually how to learn from it. How do you see that within the context of the World Bank, and maybe any broader reflection in line with the concept note you could then give that you feel like?
Sure. I've been at the World Bank for almost 25 years now. So in that sense, I'm a lifer in that. And I had the opportunity just to see how things have also evolved over time. The great chance is that we work at scale. And that's a great opportunity. But also it's challenging in the sense that oftentimes we just have to go all in, and it's hard to just scale things up progressively because it's a lot of pressure. We'd also, in terms of building knowledge into our programs, it's complex in the sense that we work in political times, not in academic cycles. And so in that sense, I think time is of essence. And I think that given the dimension of the learning crisis, time is of essence. We need to act, and we need to act now. I think that oftentimes as we try to marry programs with a knowledge agenda, and I think that again, I've been lucky that as I was starting out in my career, I was working in a program that sought to provide conditional cash transfer to kids, to trying to promote to families to send their kids to school. And at the time, the conventional wisdom was that the minimum acceptable transfer will be of about $90 per child, and that was almost as much as GDP per capita. It was a very large amount for this country, and we put into place an RCT where we we looked at different types of transfer sizes and conditions for the transfer and so on, and the government was very reluctant to do this. But at the end of the day, so we were able to show that a transfer of only $30 was sufficient to bring these big effects. and that allowed the program to expand very quickly. So it reached 3 times the number of beneficiaries that we thought initially we'll be able to reach, again, in a short amount of time. So that, I think that's an example of how knowledge can bring sort of real change in real time in fairly and sort of helped for government to see the power and the value that this type of work, this this type of research can bring about. Now, I think that what we also need to do more is about to come clean when things fall apart, and things fall apart not necessarily rarely. And so I think that again, as researchers, as just to be able to also being able to publish and share sort of the ways in which all of these great ideas sometimes sort of run into roadblocks, and then trying to sort of draw lessons from those roadblocks. Again, I think that it's something that we need to do, and we need to do more.
And if I could follow up, so how open would in an organization like the World Bank, can you do that latter thing? You could say the research can do it, but how easy is it to learn from implementation, including from failure, that, a null result on the what in a research setting is already hard to take. The how within an implementation organization must be pretty hard to take.
Look, we just finished a retrospective of the impact evaluations that the World Bank has financed over the past decade in education. And it's about, there were about 150, then we picked sort of 90 that had strong counterfactuals. And so, we brought them all together. There's a short piece that sort of looks at the types of things that we finance and why. And amongst this body of work, I was actually quite pleased to see that there are, a significant number where things did not have significant results, where things fell apart. And actually, we're putting out a blog in the coming weeks about sort of, again, those specific cases where, we didn't get the types of results or the types of impact that we're hoping for, and why that is important to call attention to.
Very, very good. Dean, if I may turn to you, you moved after, you're still, of course, very active research, but you moved into a bilateral aid delivery organization, aid organization in the US, and having worked in a bilateral before, there can be quite political organizations. They even more scared sometimes of reporting failures of things, So how can you bring research around, implementation and quality of implementation, and maybe in general also just research better into it? Tell me a bit about your experiences in bringing all these things in.
Sure. Although I do want to say clearly that I'm not here representing USAID. But I'm happy to reflect on life in a bilateral. And thank you, Matt. So actually something Rukmini said or alluded to that you left out, I think, is a nice segue on a point, which is, and now I'm going to bring this back to USAID, but or bilaterals. Right? There's something weird to me I've always felt about being a professor, particularly when I engage in outside non-academic audiences, because you get asked questions as if you're supposed to know stuff, and yet I chose to do what I do because I had questions without answers, and wanted to learn, not for the sake of learning, but for the sake of policy. But it's that openness of saying, yeah, I don't know, that makes me want to be a researcher. And so when people ask me, like, what do you know? I'm like, I don't know. I know how to, I feel like I have a good sense on how to ask questions. And yet, so that's just this weird thing. And that's, I think, speaks to something you left out as one of the key things. So you were being a bit modest, which is perfectly appropriate, given my point is there's a certain humbleness to what made that partnership work from the very beginning, which is, back in 1999, which is, we're old, when I first met Rukmini, I believe I had hair, I think. And it was, it's not random. This didn't just happen to you. right? You guys were open and willing and humble enough to say, maybe it's not working. We need to find out. We need to learn. And yeah, there's these geeks over there, and let's go find out what was what's happening. And that's I wouldn't underestimate the importance of that. That wasn't a passive thing on Prophet's part of being open in that way. But that is, going back to saying there's a lot of, the fear of failure, I don't see as like a big constraint, because quite frankly, you can fail with bad analysis, just like you can with good analysis. So I don't think like running, good evaluations actually increases the risk of some bad ramifications because some bad information gets perceived by some political party. If someone wants to, give any sort of other executive branch agency a hard time, they don't need truth to do that, And so, like, you might as well do the right thing and just do it because it's the right thing. And the politics is the politics. That's my attitude. But I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the way I would say that. I have yet to be in a situation where I have seen there be humble parties saying, we want to know, and we think this is an important area where we can learn that will help us in the future, help others in the future. Because that is the main, like, one of the big messages that I think is important for everybody, not just bilaterals, is that, like, you do this kind of work of measuring impact, not for accountability, but to help guide future allocations. And so once you have that mindset, you're not worried about failure. You're worried about not learning and then not optimizing in the future.
Excellent. And I just want to actually, a question that, you clearly, you've made the path from researchers stepping into, the world of practitioners where you need to deal with. So is there anything that you wish you had known as a researcher that you've now learned, that you wish you had known beforehand, to be a better researcher, something of that part?
Yeah, I would say it, and there's a motto that I would capture, which is in the, I primarily identify as development economist or behavioral economist, depending on what conference I'm at. If I'm going to summarize behavioral economics in 3 words, it's make it easy. You can or applied behavioral economics. You can kind of think about that as like the mantra for most policies that are trying to be informed and tinkered with by some insights from behavioral economics. The long version of that is make it easy to help people do the thing they would like to do in a moment of deep reflection and full information. That's a little bit wordier. But that is kind of implicit in what it is. It's making it easy, and so you have to figure out what that is. But we haven't done that in the translation of, as well as we can, in the translation from research to evidence. And I think of it as 3 parts. There's demand. I'm an economist, so like demand, supply, fine. So in some cases, the research actually isn't good enough, right? We need better research. So great, so do better research, do more, better, more diverse. In some cases, it is on the demand. I said it backward. That's the supply side. Demand side is, there might be issues on how to understand. It's complicated, the message. How is it communicated? Where there can be improvement. But then there's a third, which is the make it easy category, and that is and that's not something that we produce when we produce research. We don't write at the end a nice little guide that says, not just like, if we do a training program, like I have appendices and papers, and I've seen this, that sure, there's the training program. There was 16 weeks, and here's the pedagogy that went with it. That doesn't tell you how to adapt and how to contextualize something, which is the problem that a policymaker faces. And so, if there's, let's take teaching at the right level or targeted instruction, or if you're going to go into a new country and you're going to do that, it's not like just take the list from Protham and go do it. But it is possible to say, here's the 10 contextual factors that you need to know about the institutions. You need to know something about the teachers. Are they showing up? Are they not? Is that an issue? Are they going to be on board? Are they going to be contentious? Like, where's the unions? How are you going to factor in that? What are the background levels? I'm not going to list through all the questions. The point is, someone who knows that space could list those questions, and that's not an output of the research the way it could be. And so that's a bottleneck for adopting, because it's not as simple as just saying, well, there's a good paper, it's published well, that doesn't actually tell someone like, this is how you're going to apply it in this context. These are the morphs that you need to make. These might be the operational, this goes back to the implementation science. This is the implementation science questions you need to ask in order to figure out what to do and how to optimize it over in this other context. And that's, that kind of making that easy is something that we need to do better at.
Excellent. Tsingai, you've worked basically you've been in quite a few worlds, isn't it? You know, being a minister, being in the political world, sitting in the World Bank, doing a lot of advisory work also around it, you know. So any reflections you have in terms of, you know, from either what you heard or also your experience on, you know, these challenges around implementation and systematically learning from it?
Thank you very much. First of all, let me thank the organizers for inviting us to this meeting. Many of you might not know that this arises from the project RISE, which did an extraordinary amount of work in terms of research all over the place. So I'm very happy that the results of RISE are now manifesting themselves in the challenge of implementation. Why? Because we all know that often people who are very good at research are not necessarily good at implementation. That's factual information, actually. There may be some people who are double, but there are exceptions. But what I think this is important because we are at a stage in the world now where almost every country, and I'm sure Luis will agree with me on this, almost every country, even the weakest country, can actually diagnose its problems. But the challenge is how to implement a response to the challenges. And this goes for small and big countries. That even includes, unfortunately, countries in the global north. We show wonderful things in the US during COVID, which we never thought could exist in the global north. But I don't want to go there. I see a common pattern here among the speakers, which I find really interesting. My good friend here is in charge of the biggest non-government organization in the world and in education. And I really wish that many people could go and see the wonderful work she is doing. And now it is being extended to Africa. And I hope that African colleagues who are here will take advantage to seek the advice of Rukmini and her friends here. But Rukmini talked about being curious. I think that's an important part of being a good researcher, really questioning themselves. It's interesting, last week, I spent 5 days at the Kennedy School, and I think that this school is a little bit fashioned after the Kennedy School in the US. And we had a meeting of social sector ministers. It's a program that's called the Harvard Ministerial Leadership Program, which tries to train ministers because there's no university that trains ministers. And I think the kind of conversation we're having here is very similar to what took place there. And they all confessed, all the ministers without exception, that the challenge they face is implementation. It's not nuclear science to figure that out. But the real challenge is, how do you get it done? I don't know how many of you watched Kamala Harris in Chicago. And she coined an expression, don't just sit, get something done. Don't just sit there, get something going. And I think this is important because many times people in government, they suffer from inertia. The problem is too big. So who is going to do it? And I'll give you a very obvious example from Africa. The biggest challenge African countries face today is youth unemployment. How many governments, even after appointing ministers of youth, are actually doing something about the problem? I think the problem is so big that many governments, whether they are ministers or presidents, are just saying, I can't solve this problem. Let somebody else deal with it after I've left office. But the problem will only get worse. It will not get any better. So the idea of do something is really very deep. It's very important to do something, even if you don't have a theory of change, if you don't have all the mechanics in place. So I would say that doing something is important. And also being able to make decisions is important. Because I found out in my life experience from the time I was in the liberation struggle, the time I was in government, and the time at the World Bank, is that people who suffer from inertia to make decisions are the most dangerous people. People who can make decisions, even if they can make a wrong decision, they can revisit the decision and then self-correct and move forward. But those who don't make decisions, like the question of youth unemployment, they will just say, no, it's too big. It's not my problem. Let somebody deal with it. So I'm very delighted that we have these people who have really moved the needle. I listened to the conversation this morning. And one thing that concerned me a bit, and I think it comes out from what the colleagues here have been saying, is that if we are going to address the learning crisis, we need to do something big. Doing small things is not going to cut it. The problem will get only worse. So I would say that it's important to think big, and to try and confront the monster. Both Luis and Dean said something that's interesting. They talked about the importance of trying to do things systematically, but more importantly, the importance of knowledge. I think that many people fear or revere the World Bank because they think it has got a lot of money. But the 18 years I spent at the World Bank taught me that the real powerful thing about the World Bank is the knowledge it has got. And the World Bank probably has more knowledge about some countries than the people in the countries themselves know about their own countries. So that is real power. And that's where they derive their power from. And I think that being able also, like Luisa said, to be able to say, look, let's review these 130 or 120 projects and see where we went wrong is very important. Because as Mao Zedong once said, only those people who do not do anything do not make any mistakes. Because if you don't do anything, how can you make mistakes? Because you don't do anything and you don't matter. So I think that people from government who are here should really pay attention to what the three speakers have been saying, that it is very important. I don't want you to go wild and just implement without thinking. But I think the risk of delaying until you have a perfect solution means that you never start anything. So I think that it's interesting also what Dean said about knowledge. Today, knowledge is available almost anywhere. There's a lot of global knowledge on almost any problem that confronts people. But the key issue is, Dean says Yes, knowledge is global. But the key trick is to apply it locally. You can't just take teaching at the right level and wholly implement it in Zanzibar as it was implemented in India, or God forbid, even in Kenya. Because the situations are not the same. The situations are different. So you can have this knowledge, but when you do apply it, I think it's important that you take local context. Finally, I would say that I'm very happy about this meeting, but I can't help but wonder whether the organizers could not have brought more people from government. Because really, if we are going to move the needle with respect to implementation, it is the government people we should go after. It is the government people who will move the needle. I am not belittling the wonderful work that NGOs have been doing, but the truth of the matter is, if you are looking at the crisis, certainly in Africa, which I know a little bit about, it's only government that can really move the needle significantly.
Thank you, thank you. This is great. Yeah, a lot of applause. And it does help me to go to another round of questions, and panelists, you can also comment on what you heard and jump in. But I want to take a couple of the things that you just said, Nzai. How to implement, how to get it done. That's clearly where we are. That's the kind of question it is. But you said, look, think big implementation is big. And it's a big things that needs to be done. Now, research is typically about unpacking big into small questions that can be answered. Now, to be still helpful in the agenda, you said, one has to be able to prioritize within the questions because there's endless questions that could be answered. So panelists are already getting where I'm going to go to. It's like in 5 years, can you think of a number of questions that are in that spirit, probably potentially the most impactful researchable questions? So, because research still has to be, you have to pick the questions that we can give an answer to, and they typically have to be relatively small. So it's a bit like the question, when we look at implementation science here in education, so what would success look like? What questions should or could be answered, or at least in terms of an agenda being set over the next few years, what would be the kind of questions that you feel like there is priority for? And you want to come in? Very good.
I think, many things that have been said, I think, lead to this. How can the research help the implementation to be better? And how can the implementation help the research to be better? Because what you want is, whatever the effort is on both sides, to be coming together in a way that makes the biggest bump. If we go by what Zinga is saying, that you really need big steps. And you need these two. You're lucky that you have people who want to research, and you're lucky that you have implementers. Together, how do you make it? I want to give a couple of examples from our own experience. So teaching at the right level has been happening in India for quite some time. And in the first 10 years, there were several RCTs, but there was also a lot of on-the-ground experience. And we also do quite a bit of measurement ourselves within the program. And if I go to one of the RCTs that didn't have good effects, was one in which there was a lot of work done with teachers, but there wasn't enough work done with the middle level of the bureaucracy. And so the learning was that middle level of the bureaucracy, how do you bring them in? And what is the most effective way in which they can operate? From our own experience on the ground, we could see that training programs typically have manuals and training sessions, and then the teachers are left alone to kind of do their stuff. So how do you support this work in a way that actually both you learn from and you can help the different variations? And so this, again, both implementation and then an RCT, we brought in what we today call leaders of practice. That there has to be a layer above the teachers who actually are able to support it. Now, how are they able to support it? From our own experience, we knew that if they do it themselves, a lot of this big change is not standard deviations. I mean, it is, but it isn't. It is actually, if you want to bring about big change, at least I believe, you have to first do big things so you see that these big things can happen in many places. And the other is you need some missionaries for it. Now, I don't know enough about how missionaries in the world captured the world, but I think a lot of it is you have to do it because you have to learn how to do it and then you pass it on to others. So in our leaders of practice, one of the things we had come up with is to say that anybody who's going to train the teachers first does teaching at the right level themselves in a classroom of wherever they are for at least 3 weeks. Why 3 weeks? Why 3 weeks? Because on the side as Pratham, we always have some areas, Noam was calling it direct delivery models, where we know what is, you have to keep trying, you have to keep looking at what is possible in the same terrain, in the same language, with the same resources, so that you know that this is possible. So from our direct laboratories, we knew that every 10 days, children can move up 1 level. If you look at the USAID levels, we know that is possible. Hence, we want the people who are going to be our missionaries or champions to taste that success, because then you can take it further. And so that is why this the leaders of practice thing came in, and there was an RCT alongside, which helped to provide some more structure and some more, what should I say, rigor to it. And it always helps if it's published in some journal. Not that many of our government people read it, but to know that people came from whatever big university and said it's a good thing, it's always a good thing. So that helps as well. Okay, but now along comes, and I want to link it to something that somebody else said this morning, that research done somewhere else, how applicable is it? I think many people here have been saying that you need to contextualize what has been successful somewhere else here. And we find that these leaders of practice doing it is one of the best ways to contextualize it for that context. So we have a state called Karnataka in India, and teaching at the right level was going to roll out there. And the people there, the government at that point there was quite enlightened, and they said there's lots of research on it. We don't need to do the research. We need to follow through. They agreed on the leaders of practice. The people who had done it, they showed good results. They trained the teachers. And now came the point where the head of their our government partner, who was heading the teaching learning, said to me that we have about 3 months in this academic year left for this program to be done. How many times should a school be visited? You've done research in a lot of places. Mind you, this was not a research that had been done. Okay. However, we had some experience. We had money for RCT. I don't know, there's John here. I can see some JPAL people here. We had money actually in that location for an RCT, but sometimes reality moves much too fast for research to keep a pace. So I sat down and I said, look, I can tell you there's no research on this as done by other people, but our own internal intuition says that you need 6 visits in the next 3 months for each school, done by these people who actually have done it themselves and have trained the teachers. Why 6? First one, to make sure that the grouping is done right. Second one, to make sure the activities are happening, blah, blah, blah. And then at midline, you need to see who didn't make progress, so that those guys need the help the most. The weakest need the help the most. We collected data on this. The system collected data on this. And at the end of this program, we saw, on average, there had been 8 visits per school. This is 40,000 schools. People had visited it at least 8 times in those 3 months. And those that had low baselines or low midlines had received more visits than the others. And you could see it was a simple correlation that you could see. Now, is this research? Is it implementation? Was it wrong for me to say, just do this? Who knows? But I think all of this coming together and there was curiosity within the system, because people were saying, you're making me run around so much. What's the logic? The logic is you've got to help the weakest. Go back next week and see what happens. So I think that these are things that if you work very closely together as implementers, researchers, and government, there are some big things like this that I think you can together discuss and take forward, which then takes the whole sort of knowledge of what will you recommend to somebody else, forward. We have many teaching at the right level instances where people say, okay, maybe this worked in India, doesn't work here. It's like, create your missionaries, however you want to create them. But you need missionaries to take this forward who have done it themselves and therefore have contextualized it for their own surroundings. I mean, that maybe need an RCT on missionaries, but until then, I think this knowledge will have to work.
We'll do this, yeah.
Maybe I'll start with a reflection that I think that over the past decade, we have seen a sea change in terms of the breadth and the depth and the quality of education, of the research in education. I think that's a trend that we should continue to grow, and I think many of you here are representing that. In terms of sort of where are the gaps in terms of our knowledge, or where do we go from here? I would say, I would begin with, there is a lot of, for example, what we heard today in terms of all kinds of interventions that are important, that are relevant, that are needed in terms of but that happen after school, happen outside of the school, it happened around the school. And I think that ultimately the end game is actually to bring all of that into the school. It shouldn't be happening, it shouldn't be necessary for it to happen outside the school. So how do we, and the conditions by which these interventions happen outside of the school are also need to be contextualized, because they're different and the incentives are different, and the reasons why both providers and students come are different. So again, I think that we need to get our head around that. How do we bring all of that? Actually, how do we make all of this ecosystem less needed and actually the school the center of the teaching and learning process? And I think that a place where I would begin is also, I think that overall, the quality of the research on initial teacher training programs is relatively shallow and could be enriched. And ultimately, it's also the end game as to sort of, how do we make sure that there is, when a teacher trainee graduates is ready to take on, sort of and do the best they can in their jobs. Another piece that I think that I sort of been sort of harping around is, we say time and time again, so 7 out of 10 children in the developing world cannot read a paragraph that is age appropriate with comprehension by the age of 10. And I think that sort of that statistic though masks a lot of heterogeneity. And I think that part of it is, how do we tackle the fact that sort of, a significant share of the students out there, 10 to 20% on the few places where we have data, it relates to children that have learning challenges, dyslexia type of challenges, and that were like a vast number of languages we don't have any estimates whatsoever. And that, if we think that that's 10 to 20% of kids, that's a lot of kids. And then how do we use at least, even if we don't know exactly what's going on, how do we use that filter so that all of these interventions that we are testing out are not just appropriate for the average child, but also, I'm convinced that if we target this, if we ensure that these are appropriate for that population, they would be appropriate for all children. So again, I think that that's an area where I put an emphasis. And then, I would say sort of, how to look at that middle level in the education system. We oftentimes, sort of espouse that we have a systems approach, but we do know relatively little as to sort of how that, district, municipal, provincial level system, how it shapes it, how it affects, how it steers, what happens in the classroom. And it's just a black box.
Very good, very useful. Dean.
So I guess I've had enough time to think I should have a better form to answer for you, but I'm gonna invoke 2 American philosophers in my answer for you. The first is the first in terms of the first thing I want to say is I don't think I know enough to answer your question. So you need to be a bit further up there. So this is the here's where I'm going to invoke Donald Rumsfeld. There's known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And I would say I'm in the unknown unknown space on that. Now, the way I would think about trying to tackle that, though, is to break down the title of our talk today, implementation science. I've usually heard that term implementation science meant for two very different things. Yeah, they're related, but they are different. And I think that is a guidance to how I would think about trying to understand the answer to your question. The first implementation science context that I hear that phrase used is about the adoption of evidence, and just like, okay, there's evidence out there. Someone is designing a policy in a program. What is the obstacle from them using that evidence? Maybe the evidence isn't good enough. It goes back to what I was saying before, the demand and supply kind of that process. Maybe they don't have the training because they didn't come here to and so they're just not they just need to get more technical knowledge about how to read these dorky papers and things like this, right? Or maybe it's made easy. The other side, though, is on the actual implementation of programs. I mean, that's examples like Rukmini was giving, where it's like, okay, you have this broad concept, and the evidence is strong for this concept of a program, but you're going to have all these like little minutia decisions about what to do. The example that I often use on this actually is from my work. I mean, that's an overstatement of my involvement. I was the research assistant on the ground when I first met Rukmini and helping to set up the Teaching at the Right Level experiment. And it was something from there that was very much the motivation for starting Innovations for Poverty Action, was saying, okay, let's say this thing works. Who's going to do the follow-on study, and how is that going to inform policy when we need to find out whether the ratio of Balsaki to students should be 4-to-1, 6-to-1, 8-to-1? That's probably not going to be publishable in the American Economic Review, but yet that's the kind of work you need, and it's probably not a universal answer to that question either. And so how are you going to go about that? And and so putting those two together, the way I would, now I'm going to go back and give you kind of a tighter answer, which is like, you need both wide, and so you need like multi-site analysis that covers lots of different similar programs across lots of parts of the world, that it's been properly synthesized. And then if there's a gap, you'll know it, because that's not being adopted, right? In a moment where people can really engage and they say, this just doesn't apply to the problem that we're facing. And so no, I don't have guidance. Well, there's a gap if that's not useful. But it also might be a gap on the actual implementation side. They might say, great, I'm totally convinced that is a program that has strong enough evidence from lots of contexts that are similar enough to what we're facing, that's what we should do. But now here's the 10 questions I don't know about how to actually do it and how to optimize, right? And so this is where, you have kind of, I think of it as multi-site. You can go wide or you can go deep, right? So the first is going wide across the world. What is the evidence on a preponderance on a particular topic? You can also go deep in a particular context. So here I think about organizations that really build into their DNA the idea of repeated iteration, repeated testing, tinkering, learning. And some of those tests are thoroughly uninteresting, but this is the nature of the beast. It is the equivalent of testing the color of the envelope on a direct marketing. But when you build that into the culture, and you just do repeated testing, you can then continuously improve and learn how to adopt. And some of those things might actually have external validity, so you can learn from elsewhere. And so those should be documented and learned, and some of that can be. There is an intersection of these two. Things like communicating with parents about what's happening in schools, I think of as an area that I've seen some work on. You could be really systematic about learning across many different contexts, how to do such communication to really improve improve educational outcomes. And you might be able to learn a lot more by having that both deep in a particular area, testing out different ways of doing it, at the same time seeing it done across 20 places and having that dual iteration. But ultimately, the questions on what the gaps are have to be formed by literally saying, well, the people implementing are not using the evidence. Why not? That tells you where the gap is.
Great. So we're going to get Zingai again on this question, but I just want to warn you, then we'll come to you. So if you have your questions, and the people online can also still put in the questions, and then we can get there. But please.
I'll be very brief. I would focus on two words: urgency and agent. They are both important in this context. Agency, because teachers are the most important component of any education system. If you look at budgets of systems of education, teacher compensation in Africa ranges from 80% in the best case scenario up to 97%. So if you are really going to implement effective programs, you have to look at teachers and be very creative in the way you use the teachers, because that's the only wiggle room you have got. You cannot add too many things. You cannot even talk about technology unless you are saying, I'm using technology to make the teachers more efficient. I think it's important to appreciate that if you are talking about a typical system of education in Africa, teachers are your agents of change. And unless teachers can change their behavior, you're not going to implement anything. Because it is the teachers who ultimately have to implement your programs. And I think the example that Rugumini gave really came alive to me. When I became Minister of Education in 1980, I had so many things I needed. And I sat down, I spent a lot of time thinking, and I decided to do two things. First, teachers. That's all I focused on. Teachers. Other things can come later on. Many people, many government leaders, they like to cut ribbons. I was not interested in ribbons. Kids could learn under trees. I didn't care. I had kids learning under trees. But if you have teachers, and teachers are committed to actually transforming the system, your job is done. So I would concentrate on teachers. Finally, agents. We have to do this yesterday. We need to be agent in the way we implement education programs. Because if we don't do this, by the end 2030, we'll be far, far behind than we are already now. So I would add these two words: agents of change, changing teacher behavior, using teachers effectively. The matter is agent, it cannot wait until yesterday.
Very, very good. We go to the room now. So, get your hands up. There's microphones room. There's one at the back there to start. We're going to take quite a few. We have about 20 minutes for questions still, so get them in early. Yeah, so we begin there.
Hi, my name is Zainab Amjad and I'm from Ideas 42. Thank you to all the panelists for sharing your insights with us today. I had one question for Rukminji Banerjee. You mentioned the power of coalition building and getting researchers, implementers, and government officials to work together. And I wanted to learn from your experience on this kind of coalition building. Often in my experience, implementers, researchers, and government officials have very different agendas, very different incentive structures, and it can be quite hard to bring everyone on the same page. And I'd love to hear lessons and learnings from your work on how you've done that effectively. Thank you.
Right, on that side.
Thank you. My question is for Luis. I wanted to ask, following the analysis of past World Bank implementation and studying the challenges, the lessons learned, what do you do with the lessons learned? Do you go back to those countries and maybe re-implement based on the lessons, or it's just another big vacuum?
Right, behind you there, yeah. Anyone here?
Debbie.
Hands here, so maybe go at the back first, and then we go. No, please go behind.
Debbie.
Behind. Yeah, that way. No. I was directing the other ones.
Thank you so much. My question is for our former minister. I think it's quite often rare to get, government, especially at the highest level, to be interested in, programming that will actually make impact. So my question to you is, what's an advice that you can share with implementers to keep the momentum and try to work at all levels within government, over a sustained period of time, even though they're challenging actors in government?
Hello, hi. Sorry, Elif Kubilay from University of Essex. So I have one question about, we test programs and we implement programs, and this often involves people who are on the front line, like teachers and headmasters, to be heavily involved. So we convince them to implement a program or test a program. And sometimes, as you also commented, things fall apart or we don't find any effects. So what I feel as a research committee, I think we are kind of letting down those people who are on the front line because we are not really going back and explaining them, look, we did this like for, I don't know, like a year and we tested and it didn't work out. So this is what we learned. So I was wondering what you would recommend us researchers or policymakers, what should we do so that we are really engaging them and we are letting them know what happened as an outcome?
So we go over here, and then we go with the other microphone on this side.
Thank you, everybody. This was a really inspiring panel. I really appreciate it. My question stems from something Dean said, but it actually could be for everyone. It has to do a bit with the knowledge translation part. You said, make it easy, and we're not doing that enough in translation of evidence. You also said at the end that the reason, or we have to explore why implementers aren't using evidence to inform is because evidence not there. So my question is the evidence not there, or are we not making it accessible enough to these leaders, to these decision makers, and to these implementers? And if anyone on the panel has some exciting and innovative examples of what they've seen of knowledge translation, including from within the hub, if possible.
I know we have lots of hands on this side. Yeah, no.
So I'm going to do something a bit unusual. I'm going to request some homework. If you had to give homework to the What Works Hub, what would it be? What do you think we should be doing over the next 6 years to maximize the chance of making a dent in implementation science?
So there's some more hands. We can add a few more.
Does anybody remember the questions?
But it's, they all spread out a little bit, and there's so many hands that I rather want to keep them going.
This question is for the former minister. Based on something that Tahir said earlier about how in India, there's you could have an archaeology of all the different interventions that have been put in place. And then we also heard from various presenters today about having advisory boards where we're engaging ministers and government in the whole research process. I'm just curious about, from your perspective, how researchers and donors could be more effectively and efficiently engaging ministries of education, given the number of interventions that are being carried out and the large amount of research that's being carried out in each of these contexts. How we can work better together?
So I think enough questions for now, but please don't try to answer all of them, each of you. So just pick and choose a little bit. And if you feel like, a few can be left hanging, and I will try to do another round as well. Yeah. Shall we start with you?
So the first question was to me. Some anecdotes. Recently, about a year ago, there was some consortium being put together for, taking education reform forward at the government level. And we were invited to the meeting. My colleagues went and they came back and they said, not sure what they were trying to do, because we were asked to say, are you a knowledge partner or you are a doer? And these were two different buckets. You could not have knowledge if you did, and if you did, you couldn't have knowledge. And I think my colleagues did the right thing by saying that was not a place for us, because we think that when you do, you think, and etc. But I think that these are long-run relationships. I mean, in my experience, I would say that one of the reasons we have our direct work laboratories in different places is because there's ongoing work. Sometimes you're participating with the government, sometimes you're doing research, but there is an ongoing way in which you're dealing with the let's say with the learning crisis. I think a lot depends on how much talking who does at what level. Because I think friendships, both, if you're very good friends, you listen to each other. If you're enemies, you also listen to each other. So I'm not advocating they should have strategic enemies in different places, but I think that the more you talk, so I'll give you an example. In one of the RCTs that was done at some point by JPAL, there was, the research design was in place, blah, blah, blah. And suddenly there was going to be a summer camp which would cover everyone. So at that point, one of the principal investigators was a wonderful gentleman by the name of Michael Walton, who some of you may know. And literally we had to go around the areas where the RCT was happening to ask people not to do the summer camp. I think that, firstly, an Englishman in June in India, in the heat, making the effort to come to you to explain why you should not do something was so unique. Because all the teachers said, we're constantly being told to work. And here is someone who's come from abroad to tell us, don't work. This is very unusual. But I think it took, I think that particular case, there was so much talk about what is the control group, why is the research happening, what will we learn as a result of it, and so on and so forth. So I think we don't have enough talk at different levels. I think there is, I firmly believe most people are curious. It's just that there isn't a platform on which you can raise your questions. And I think long run friendships between these parties, we've been very lucky in our 20, 30 years of work that every researcher we've worked with, we really felt were real partners. They were really interested in the questions that were plaguing us. And I think that we were interested in the questions that they asked. So I think, I don't know how to create this. I mean, the word systems and all that is too complicated. It's just friendships, lots of talk. Tea helps. If electricity goes out, that's another good place. You can't do anything else. You can't be on email. You will talk about what you're doing. These are the ways to build, I think, longer run ways in which you can work together.
Very good. Yep.
Okay, first question was, how do you influence policy at the highest level? One of the best ways of doing it is to actually demonstrate that you are using the resources properly. I'll give you an example outside education. So one of my former staff from the World Bank, Mohamed Pate from Nigeria, when he was asked to be Minister of Health in the previous government, he went to the president and said, it's a shame that a country like Nigeria can still have polio. If you give me enough money, I can assure you that I will wipe out polio from this country. And the president was persuaded. So he said, okay, what do you want? So he went and talked to Big Win, he went and talked to Michael Case, and the government eventually put $100 million. And today, Nigeria is completely free of polio. And he has been asked to come back to the government because they know that he's effective, again, second time as Minister of Health. So I think that if you can demonstrate a Minister of Finance, I know this from my experience, if you can demonstrate that you are using the money properly, they will give you the money. The Minister of Finance wants the economy to grow. And he knows that education and health are important levers for economic growth. So if you can demonstrate that you are actually using the resources properly, that's the best way of actually ensuring that your programs can be supported. The second question was on how researchers can engage effectively with ministers. I would raise 2 points here. The first point is that when you carry out your research, if you want it to be implementable, you must make it so simple in terms of how you write it, in terms of the recommendation, that even my grandmother can understand it. The problem is that sometimes the research is so weird, so complex, so weird, that the minister will say, but what am I being asked to do? So it's very important to make it translatable into something that can be implemented. Otherwise, the minister will just say, this is like an academic paper, I'm not interested.
So the question was sort of lessons learned from the World Bank. The World Bank has its own independent evaluation group, and actually they just completed a 10-year retrospective of the bank's portfolio in basic education that's coming out in the next few weeks. And there, sort of the two big sort of messages are, one, sort of the importance of focusing on outcomes, and this really very much relates to sort of the conversation we had earlier this morning about results-based financing and sort of outcomes-based projects. But the question really began, sort of what outcomes do you want to focus on, because that's going to drive your process, and it will create incentives and disincentives for a wide variety of things. And then secondly, the other second big message was about teachers and how the importance to look at sort of how to support teachers and think about teachers holistically, from recruitment into teacher training colleges all the way to placement and retirement and everything in between, but at the same time being able to chunk it appropriately so that you can have bite-sized entry points for intervention so that you can bring about change. But deciding what those entry points is not necessarily obvious. And I think that overall, in terms of how do we learn as an organization, something perhaps more general is there's a lot of tacit knowledge in the organization that sits there. There are a lot of people with tons of experience and people who they retire, and then sort of all of that knowledge is lost. And how do we capture that? It's really important, and I don't think that we pay enough attention to that. And equally, so I think that if we think about the gray literature. Again, the gray literature covers all kinds of areas that sort of the academic journal publications do not cover. And so again, being able to rescue that and then sort of being able to focus on it, I think that it's really crucial and important. And then finally, in terms of homework, I mean, I would agree with Zingai that government is really important. And when we think about what Works Hub and the implementation science, again, I think that we need to truly sort of unpack and dig deep on the implementation. But let us not forget that also the next step is institutionalization. And that we, again, so being able to build that capacity in government to deliver services of high quality to all children is the end game.
So two questions I'll tackle. The question on how do we know if there's enough evidence or not? Is the issue the supply of evidence, or is the issue on the take-up? So two thoughts. One is we're never going to be in a corner solution on this. It's never going to be 0 or 1. There's any empirical question out there. Like if you can't create doubt, then something's wrong with you. It's not that hard to be like, we don't know everything about something. But there's also the case that there's nothing that we truly know nothing about, right? So you're in a spectrum. And that's another way of saying this is going to requires judgment, and people will disagree about how much you know and things like this. Ultimately, I think the test is two things. It is about what are the decisions that the decision makers need to be making, and do they actually is there enough information for them to make that decision? So, and that's basically an extrapolation story. Like if there's enough evidence out there that you can extrapolate to the new context and make a good prediction that with a good review of that evidence, people feel comfortable that that's a good prediction, then that means you're on the closer to one side of that spectrum, that you're fully there, right? And the second thing you have to realize is at the end of the day, knowledge generation and research is a scarce, there's only so many researchers, only so much budget for that. And so just because there's a knowledge gap doesn't mean go fill it. There's a trade-off of filling some other knowledge gap, and you have to allocate accordingly. And we all have to think that way as researchers and also as funders as we're funding research. We have to figure out what is the gaps. And ultimately it's just a matter of extrapolation. How confidently can you extrapolate to the new context? The trap that needs to be avoided is the trap of, oh, it's been tested over there, but I don't know if it'll work here. And stated that in that deeply agnostic, atheoretical way is not the right way of phrasing it. You got to be able to say something about the theory of why it's working, which then embeds into it the contextual factors that may influence whether it works, and then you look at the new context. And you ask, what are the contextual factors there to help guide on what I should do? This is one of the reasons why at USAID, for instance, when we're putting out soon a review and a kind of a best buy guide on primary school educational outcomes, and very deliberately they're not ranked. There's a few things that fall into best buy. There's also a few that fall into promising buy, and our jargon for those two mean is exactly on this point. They might have the same exact point estimate for what we expect each to generate, but if it's a best buy, it means we have a very tight posterior, so to speak, to put it in Bayesian terms of like, we really feel comfortable that it's going to generate X, and we feel really comfortable about knowing that it's going to generate X in these contexts. A promising buy might also generate X. We might actually have the same exact expectation, but we're like, yeah, but we're less confident of that extrapolation. And so that's an area that needs more research. So that's my answer for you, too. No, that we need more of that kind of multi-site element. So things like the example I gave on how do you have parents engaged? Like that can be the type of thing that a convener like what you've built. I mean, you built, there's two things here. So I would put the two together in your head. I'm sure you're thinking about this. You have youth impact, which is basically built into a DNA in the culture of that place, is just iterative testing and learning. And then you have convenings like this. So I put those two together, and I think there's a magic there that can happen by coming up with protocols that are things like, how do you communicate with parents? Now, tons of people running all sorts of different education programs. Every one of those might benefit from having some communication to parents that says what's happening in that program. And we could probably learn a lot by testing out communication with parents across many, many contexts.
Right, so look, I think we ran out of time, but there were a lot of hands here. So who dares to be the two people that will ask a very brief 20-second question that gets very short answer here? Oh, there's the courageous people here in front and one at the back. These are the two people that make us run over, okay? Yeah, very short, very short.
So my question is about implementation science. Implicit in everyone's conversation is that implementation science equals RCTs, but so much of what you're talking about when you say implementation involves a whole host of other forms of knowledge. So can you please speak to that and the value of incorporating that in the hub?
Right. And I almost take it, can have a very short answer as a kind of a comment as well. Yes.
Okay, so my question is for Luis. It's why do you think that we've largely neglected initial teacher training as a site for research and implementation? And don't you think that we need to be focusing on that? Because I think that we could perhaps bring about system change in a shorter period of time if we did do that.
Thank you. So I'm going to get Luis, and I think Rukmini, you're going to answer that other question. Very good. Luis.
The reason I'm not sure, but I think it's hard. And it's been a black hole. There's a lot more research about sort of in-service training, sort of continuous professional development. And so I would say we just need more models of good pre-service training. And then in terms of your question, I would say we need more process evaluations for sure.
I would just turn Akshay's question to Noam to say, obviously, there's lots of different ways. There are organizations, governments learning inside and so on. But it's important because I think the regular research has a whole community. There's, who's consuming it, how it's delivered. Who is this for? Are they in the room? Are you making it for some fictitious audience? All of that, I think, are questions that the What Works Hub will tackle. That, is there a whole other place where this needs to be discussed and not at a university?
Very good. I would propose that we end here. This is a very nice open question. Are we in the right room? But it's true. Are we in the right room? And I heard all kinds of comments. I'm not going to try to summarize it, but I think, I think it's time to close this day. It was an exciting day, an intense day. Lots of people still here. Thank you very much. Thank you to all the panel. It's easy.